I have always thought our town was stitched together by its linden trees. They line the lake promenade, leaning in like old friends who remember every summer and forgive every winter. In June, the blossoms fall in a golden hush and the air grows heavy with a sweetness you can taste. My days pass mostly in the library, 2 rooms, a creaking stair, and windows that open only if coaxed. The post office is on the other side of the wall, so I often hear the tap of parcels on the counter, the gossip of stamps being pressed into place. I know most faces that come through the library door. That's why I noticed him. It was a Tuesday near noon when the chapel bells rang 3 minutes late. A man stepped in, carrying the faint smell of lake water. He had the posture of someone accustomed to working with small, precise things, shoulders forward, gaze steady. He said, "Good morning," in a voice both deliberate and unhurried. He was looking for old maps, preferably with handwritten notes about the shoreline before the reservoir was built. I brought out the folio of municipal charts, leather worn at the corners, the smell of a cupboard that once held apples. He didn't open it right away, just rested his palm on it, as if making an unspoken promise. "You're not from here," I said. "No. My town had different trees." When he finally opened the folio, the pages whispered like sugar paper. He worked without licking his fingers, a habit I always approve of. His hands were marked with tiny nicks, the kind careful tools make. He was, it turned out, a map engraver in town for a few weeks to create a facsimile of the earliest shoreline for the museum annex. The curator had suggested I might know who wrote the marginal notes on the old maps. He called them the climate of a hand. That afternoon, I closed the library early and walked to the annex. The door sticks unless you lift and pull. I did. Inside, he was bent over a copper plate, the beginnings of a shore etched in faint, glimmering lines. I set a jar of linden honey on the workbench. "A welcome my lamp couldn't provide," he said. We spoke of little things, the fairy rope older than the fairy, how peonies leave rings on wood. He told me of his hometown near a glove factory, where even children's hands were measured once. I told him about Zoya, a teacher I suspected had written those old notes, her script leaning left, as if bracing against wind. The next morning, I brought him the binder of municipal minutes. Hidden between budgets were Zoya's observations, puddles large as horses, the old woman by the ferry sells raspberries by the thimble, not to cheat, but to measure joy. He listened as I read, watching my face as though he was mapping it too. We walked the promenade before the cyclists claimed it. I pointed out a narrow bend in the shore. "Wedding shoes," I said. He showed me a ring of planks. "Dignitaries." We exchanged these names as if we'd always done so. At the pier, Sasha the ferryman poured us tea from his dented thermos. The lake bumped the wood like a sleepy animal. A boy with a blue kite asked if we'd seen the wind. "It's unreliable as a guest," Mikhail told him, and the boy nodded as if this confirmed a long-held theory. We parted at the square. "Tomorrow," he said, and the word felt like a bench someone had saved for us. The following day began with rain so fine it seemed to hover instead of fall. The library smelled of damp coats and the faint mineral scent that comes when the lake decides to breathe inland. I spent the morning reshelving returns, glancing every so often at the binder I meant to carry to the annex again. By the time I arrived, Mikhail had set his copper plate aside and was sketching in pencil on thin tracing paper. A faint smile crossed his face when he saw the binder under my arm. "You're punctual," he said. "I'm a librarian. We measure time by other people's returns." We read more of Zoya's notes. Boys built a raft from crates, forbid them kindly after the second nail. Mikhail laughed under his breath. He said the handwriting felt like a shoreline itself, steady in some places, restless in others. After we finished, he suggested coffee. We crossed the square to the small cafe with 3 tables and a wall of mismatched cups. The owner, Tamara, had a memory for preferences. She poured mine with milk, his black. Outside, the rain had thinned, and the linden leaves gleamed as if polished. He spoke little, but his silences felt companionable. He told me he worked best in places where the air carried some trace of water, lakes, rivers, harbors. Dry towns make me restless, he said. That afternoon, we walked by the ferry landing. Sasha was mending a net for no reason other than habit. No one fishes seriously this time of year. He asked Mikhail if maps can show smells. Mikhail said no, but that perhaps they should. We lingered at the edge of the pier, the boards beneath our feet soft with age. The lake lay still, a sheet of pewter under the late light. He asked if the promenade looked the same in winter. I told him yes, but quieter, as if the trees and benches agreed to keep their counsel until spring. On the way back, he stopped to buy 2 pears from a woman selling fruit from a basket. He handed me one without ceremony. It was cold and sweet, and the juice caught on my sleeve. He noticed, but didn't mention it. That evening, Aunt Katia set tea on the porch. She asked after the map man. I told her only that he listens more than he speaks. She nodded as if that were a virtue. Listening, she said, is just reading without paper. I wrote in my notebook before bed, the way a pear tastes when shared mid-walk, rain making the linden leaves shine like conversation. 2 days after the rain, the air settled into that clear, late summer stillness where sounds seemed to travel farther. The bells from the chapel reached the promenade, as though the lake itself was carrying them. I'd brought a stack of returns to the annex, not because they belonged there, but because I wanted an excuse to walk. Mikhail was leaning over a small box of tools, polishing a burin with the attention one might give to a delicate watch. He glanced up and, without greeting, asked if I'd like to see the lake from the ferry. Sasha was tying off the rope when we arrived. A rare thing, he said, to take the ferry without anywhere to be. He waved us aboard with the generosity of a man who approves of idleness. The lake lay open and glassy, disturbed only by the ferry's slow churn. We stood near the rail, watching the shore recede. From here, the Linden Promenade was just a thin line of green against the pale facades of the square. Mikhail pointed toward the bend. It looks smaller from the water, he said. Everything does, until you're standing in it, I replied. Halfway across, the wind rose just enough to press against our faces. The scent was part resin from the trees, part iron from the pier. A gull followed briefly, then veered off toward some unseen certainty. On the return, Sasha brought out 2 chipped mugs of tea from his small cabin. The tea was strong, almost smoky. Mikhail held his cup without drinking right away, as if taking its warmth before the taste. When we stepped ashore, the light was changing, afternoon sliding toward evening. I walked back through the square beside him, neither of us in any rush. The baker's wife called from her window that she had fresh rolls cooling. We stopped for 2, their heat wrapped in brown paper. He carried his as though it were another map, careful not to crush it. At the corner where our paths split, he offered a quiet until tomorrow. I watched him cross toward the annex, the paper packet in one hand, the last of the sunlight on his shoulders. That night, I wrote, a ferry ride without a destination still takes you somewhere. Aunt Katia asked, in the way she asks most things, as if it were already decided. Bring your map man to see the hives. The bees are in a good mood this week. I told Mikhail the next morning at the annex. He paused in his work, the burin resting on the copper like a bookmark. I've never stood near bees, he said. Only drawn their fields. We walked the short path to Aunt Katia's garden in the afternoon, when the sun was high enough to keep the shadows gentle. Her hives sit beyond the vegetable beds, painted in uneven stripes of blue and green. The air around them shimmered with motion. Stand calm, she instructed, handing each of us a netted hat. They know when you fidget. Mikhail obeyed, his posture that same stillness he brought to the copper plate. The bees moved in and out, each carrying its own small errand. It's like a harbor, he murmured, only no one argues about docking. Aunt lifted one of the frames, heavy with amber light. She let him hold it a moment. Don't drop it, she warned. I wouldn't dare, he said, and I believed him. We sat under the shade of the quince tree afterward, tea cooling in our cups, honey on thick slices of bread. Mikhail traced one finger over the rim of his mug, leaving a faint ring of sweetness. "This," he said, "is exactly the color I try to capture in the shallow parts of a map, where the water is warm and the bottom close." Aunt Katya approved of that answer. "Then you'll leave with a jar," she said. "But only if you promise not to eat it all at once." When we walked back toward town, the late light touched the linden leaves, turning them the same gold as the honey. I thought about how still he'd stood among the bees, and how some people carry quiet with them like a tool they've learned to use well. That night, I wrote, "A harbor of bees. A jar of gold to be opened slowly." The market was still open when the sun began to lower, though most of the stalls had already covered their baskets. The air was full of the mixed scents of the day, ripe plums, with smoke from a cooking fire, the faint briny note of fish wrapped in paper. I found Mikhail standing at a table where an old man sold hand-carved whistles shaped like birds. He picked one up, turned it over in his hand, and smiled without blowing into it. "My father could make these," he said quietly. "Only he never sold them. Said they were for coaxing spring back early." We wandered between the last open stalls, stopping for a slice of cheese wrapped in vine leaves. The woman behind the table insisted we take an extra piece for walking. Mikhail carried it in his palm as if it were something fragile. When we reached the far edge of the square, the lamps had begun to flicker on. Their light pooled on the cobblestones, turning the evening into small golden islands. We sat on the low wall by the fountain. A boy chased his dog in wide circles, the splash of their steps blending with the sound of the water. He offered me the last bit of cheese. "We should eat it now," he said, "before it remembers it belongs to the stall." I laughed and took it, the salt sharp against my tongue. We didn't speak much after that. It was enough to watch the market fold itself away, stall by stall, until only the fountain and the lamps remained. The quiet that followed felt less like an ending and more like the first line of something we didn't need to write down. I walked home with the warmth of the evening still in my hands. In my notebook, markets end like summer days, one stall at a time, each light deciding when to go out. By late August, the air in our town grows heavy with the smell of fruit left too long in baskets. Bees linger near anything sweet, and even the water in the lake seems to move more slowly. The market square fills with stalls of plums, jars of honey, and round loaves with cracked tops. Aunt Katya's stand is always the same: 6 jars of honey, neatly labeled, and a plate of sliced bread for tasting. I found Mikhail there one morning, a jar in his hand. He asked if linden blossom, early summer, was different from late summer. Katya told him early honey is light and floral, late honey richer, like a story told in winter. He bought one of each. We walked together to the annex. On the way, we stopped at the shoemaker's window, where a single pair of wedding shoes sat on a shelf. "For the bend in the shore," I said. He smiled without asking for explanation. In the annex, he worked on adding tiny gardens to the map. Zoya's note about onions and patience, now a careful patch of etched lines. I sat nearby, reading a thin volume of poems from the library's neglected shelf. We spoke only now and then, the kind of quiet where both people keep their place without needing to mark it. That afternoon, the square hosted the summer's last concert. A small band played under a canvas awning, their music mingling with the scent of grilled bread. We found a spot at the edge of the crowd. Children darted past with paper windmills, their colors flashing in the low sun. He asked if I ever left town. "Sometimes," I said, "but I always come back. This place remembers me better than anywhere else." He nodded as though that made sense to him. As the music wound down, he bought 2 cups of lemonade, handed me one, and suggested we take the long way back along the water. The lake reflected the string of lanterns above the promenade, each trembling light doubled in the ripples. We paused by the dignitary's planks. The wood was damp, smelling faintly of tar. He rested his hand there a moment, as if to measure its age. I asked what he'd do when the engraving was finished. "Another shore," he said. "But this one will stay with me." That night, I wrote, "Some conversations are like lanterns over water. They don't change the lake, but they make you look longer." The morning after the concert, the sky was a pale wash, the kind that makes colors seem gentler. I opened the library early, more out of habit than need, and found a letter waiting in the drop slot, no stamp, just my name written in a careful, upright hand. Inside was a page torn from an old map, the kind with faint watermarks in the paper. Across the empty space where a sea should have been, Mikhail had drawn a single line, curling like a slow river. At its end, in small script, were the words, "For when you need a way back." There was no signature, but none was needed. I folded it into my notebook and carried it to the annex that afternoon. He didn't mention the letter, and I didn't either. Instead, we worked side by side, he with his tools, I with a stack of unlabeled photographs from the municipal archives. Every so often, we'd trade a comment about a shoreline in a photograph, a word in Zoya's notes, the way light shifted across the table. When the clock tower struck 4, we walked out together. The promenade was empty except for a fisherman repairing his net and a dog stretched full length in the sun. We stopped by the dignitary's planks and stood there for a while, watching the ripples break against the wood. As we turned to leave, he said, "If you ever find a place that feels like this, even far away, write to me." "I will," I said. And I meant it. That evening, I took the map page from my notebook and pinned it above my desk. It looked less like a direction and more like a promise. The wind arrived from the north that morning, rattling the shutters and sending dry linden leaves skipping across the square like small, urgent messengers. The library felt even smaller than usual, the windows humming softly in their frames. Mikhail appeared just after 10, carrying a bundle wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the big table without a word, untying the string to reveal a stack of cream-colored stationery, the edges deckled and faintly rough to the touch. "For correspondence," he said, as though it needed no more explanation. We sat opposite each other, the binder of Zoya's notes closed between us, and began to write, not to each other exactly, but in the presence of each other. His hand moved steadily, pausing only to consider a word. Mine drifted, stopping to watch a leaf catch against the window before being whisked away again. Now and then, the wind slipped in through the gaps and stirred the loose sheets on the table. We used mugs of tea as paperweights, the steam leaving soft half-moons on the pages. After a while, he looked up and asked, "Do you think Zoya ever wrote letters she didn't send?" "Probably," I said. "Some words feel safer when they don't have to arrive." We didn't read each other's letters. When we finished, he folded his and slipped it into a plain envelope, sealing it with nothing more than a pressed thumb. I placed mine inside a book of poems from the 1930s, tucking it between 2 pages about autumn. Outside, the wind kept up its restless circuit around the square. Inside, the air was warm with tea and the faint mineral smell of ink. It was the sort of day that felt as if it could last forever simply because nothing demanded it to end. That evening, in my notebook, I wrote, "Letters written in the same room carry their own kind of address." It happened overnight, the first frost. When I stepped outside in the morning, the grass glittered in the low light, each blade holding its own fragile armor. The lake was still, but the air above it carried a sharper scent, as if the water had drawn in a long breath. That afternoon, Mikhail suggested we walk by the shore. We followed the path past the ferry landing, where Sasha stood stamping his feet for warmth, rope coiled loosely in his hands. "You'll be the last ones out today," he called after us. The frost hadn't melted in the shaded parts of the promenade. Each step on the board sounded slightly different, as if the cold had tuned the wood to a new pitch. The linden trees were bare now, their branches tracing black lines against the pale sky. When we reached the narrow bend, the place of the wedding shoes, Mikhail crouched down and touched the frost on the planks. "It's like the map before I start engraving," he said. "All the shapes are there, just waiting for the lines." We stayed there until the sky began to tint toward evening. The first thin skin of ice had formed in the shallows, catching the light in a way that made it look almost warm. Neither of us spoke much. It was enough to share the cold and the view. On the way back, we stopped at the cafe. Tamara had placed a vase of dried grasses on each table, the color of late honey. We sat by the window, our breath clouding the glass. Mikhail drew with his fingertip, a curve that might have been the bend in the shore, or perhaps something else entirely. When I got home, Aunt Claudia was steeping tea heavy with mint. "First frost," she said. "The year is turning its last page." In my notebook, some days are too quiet to remember and too quiet to forget. The winter market always arrives without warning. One morning the square is empty, and the next it's full of stalls draped in wool blankets, their tables lined with jars of preserves, baskets of walnuts, and rows of beeswax candles that smell faintly of summer. Mikhail and I wandered between them, our breath rising in thin clouds. The cold had sharpened the air enough to make every sound seem closer, the snap of a crate being opened, the creak of a wooden sign in the wind. We stopped at a stall where a woman sold tiny carved boxes, each no larger than a matchbook. She told us they were for keeping small certainties. Mikhail picked one with a lid inlaid with a simple compass rose. He didn't open it, just held it in his palm as if testing its weight. A little further on, Aunt Claudia was at her usual place, her jars of honey glowing like lanterns against the gray day. She slipped one into my bag without a word, as she always did. For when the year is turning its last page. In my notebook, some days are too quiet to remember and too quiet to forget. We ended near the fountain, which had been drained for the season, its stone basin lined with pine branches. A group of children were roasting chestnuts over a small brazier, the smoke curling upward into the still air. One of them offered us a paper cone, the nuts wrapped in a scrap of old newsprint. The warmth seeped through the paper into my hands. We ate them slowly, leaning against the fountain's edge. The square had begun to empty, the stallholders folding their blankets and latching their crates. Mikhail turned the small box over in his hand again before slipping it into his coat pocket. "What will you keep in it?" I asked. He smiled. "Something small enough to stay with me." That night, the smell of roasted chestnuts lingered in my coat, and I wrote, "Winter markets sell things for the hands and things for the keeping." The evening was already dark when I heard the knock at the door. Mikhail stood on the porch, his collar dusted with frost. "Your aunt invited me for tea," he said, as though it were the most natural reason to appear at my door. Inside, Aunt Claudia had set the small table with her winter teapot, the heavy brown one with a chip in the spout, and 3 cups. The air was thick with the scent of black tea and lemon peel. A plate of honey cakes sat in the center, their tops still tacky with glaze. We talked about nothing urgent, how the bees were settling for the cold months, how the ferry rope would be stored, how the lake might look if it froze all the way across. Mikhail listened more than he spoke, his hands wrapped around the cup as if the warmth were something he could take with him. At one point, Aunt disappeared into the pantry and returned with a small jar of late summer honey. She placed it in front of him. "For the road," she said simply. He looked at her, then at me, as if the gift carried more than its weight. "Thank you," he said. "I'll make it last." After tea, we stepped outside together. The night was still, the frost catching the light from the porch lamp in tiny points. Our breath hung in the air before drifting upward, as though it might join the stars. We didn't speak much on the walk back to his lodgings. The snow hadn't yet arrived, but the air held its promise. At the corner by the square, he paused. "Tomorrow?" "Yes," I said. When I returned home, the house was warm with the last of the fire's heat. I wrote in my notebook, "Some evenings are made of nothing but tea, honey, and the knowledge that time is folding in." The morning was pale and quiet, the kind where even the gulls seemed to speak softer. I found Mikhail at the annex, the copper plate wrapped and leaning against the wall, his tools already packed away. He suggested we take the promenade one last time before the day filled with errands. We started at the ferry landing, where Sasha was oiling the wooden benches. keeping them ready for spring, he said. Everything waits better when it's cared for. The boards along the promenade were rimmed with frost, making each step a careful one. We passed the bend of the wedding shoes, the dignitaries' planks, the bench where we had once shared a pair. Each place felt both entirely the same and slightly altered, as though our walks had left some invisible thread between them. Mikhail paused now and then, glancing toward the lake, as if taking a final mental sketch. It's strange, he said. Maps can hold the shape of a place, but not the hours spent in it. We stopped at the shoemaker's window. The wedding shoes were still there, a faint film of dust on their leather. I wondered aloud if they would ever be worn. Maybe, he said. Or maybe they're exactly where they belong. When we reached the square, the bakery windows were fogged from the ovens. The smell of bread carried out into the cold air, warm and grounding. We didn't go in, just stood for a moment, letting the scent stay with us. On the way back toward the annex, he said, it's good to walk the same path twice in a day. The light teaches you something different each time. I nodded, knowing I'd remember that long after he was gone. That evening, I wrote, a place can't know it's being remembered, but it can make it easy for you to try. The cafe was nearly empty when we stepped inside. Tamara was polishing the glass jars of sugar, the smell of fresh bread and coffee weaving through the air. Outside, the square was still half in shadow, the sun just beginning to light the upper windows. We took the table by the window, the one with the small crack in the glass that catches the light in a tiny prism. Mikhail ordered black coffee. I asked for tea. Tamara brought a plate of buttered rolls without being asked, setting them between us with a quiet smile. For a while, we simply watched the square wake. The baker's apprentice swept the steps in front of the shop, his broom moving in a slow rhythm. A boy in a red scarf walked by with a basket of apples, their skins catching the light like small embers. You can tell a lot about a place by its mornings, Mikhail said. And what does this one tell you? I asked. That it's the kind of place that opens its eyes slowly, so it can keep its dreams a bit longer. We shared the rolls, each tearing pieces by hand. Crumbs gathered on the saucers, and the steam from our cups fogged the lower edge of the window. A small dog wandered into the square, looked around, and settled by the fountain as if claiming it for the day. When our cups were empty, we didn't rush to leave. It was enough to sit there, knowing the day was moving forward but not yet asking us to catch up. That afternoon, I wrote in my notebook, some mornings are generous enough to let you linger in them. September had settled fully now, the mornings edged with cold, the lake darker and quicker to ripple under the wind. The linden leaves were mostly gone, their scent only a trace in the air. The day before Mikhail was to leave, I found him at the annex. The copper plate was wrapped and leaning against the wall, his tools neatly stowed away. The table looked bare without them. He stood by the tall window, watching the ferry rope sway in the wind. Will you walk the promenade with me once more? I asked. We went the long way, starting at the ferry landing. Sasha was there, humming some tune I didn't recognize, his hands deep in his coat pockets. Off to measure the lake one last time, he called. We waved back, but didn't answer. The boards were dry now, though the air carried the damp of the season. At the bend in the shore, our wedding shoes, the water lapped gently at the pilings. Mikhail leaned on the railing, his gaze following a boat far in the distance. It's strange, he said. The places you've walked the most are often the hardest to put on a map. We moved on, passing the dignitaries' planks, the bench where we had shared a pair, the shoemaker's window with the untouched wedding shoes. Each stop felt like a quiet catalog of what we had gathered together. By the time we reached the square, the sun was lowering, turning the windows to small pools of gold. He turned to me. You'll keep the binder? Of course. And maybe, walk here sometimes. I already do, I said. There was no ceremony to the parting. Just a shared stillness, a pause, and then the word tomorrow carrying with it the unspoken truth that our paths would soon diverge. That evening, Aunt Katia poured tea without asking questions. On the table was a small jar of late summer honey, set aside as if waiting for a season when it would be needed. The linden trees rustled faintly outside, though most of their leaves had already fallen. I thought of the plate, the ferry rides, the bees, the frost, the small carved box, the mornings at the cafe. And I realized that some goodbyes aren't a single moment. They're stitched together from all the days before. Before bed, I wrote in my notebook, "A place stays with you not because you walked through it, but because it walked through you." Thank you for spending time with the Linden Promenade. I hope you enjoyed walking these quiet paths, pausing at the bends in the shore, and lingering in the small moments as much as I did telling them. If you'd like to stay a little longer in this kind of world, you'll find more gentle stories waiting for you here on this channel.